Hey guys, Brian from Boas here. I get a lot of questions from my viewers about boa related topics that they're worried about, and many times they just don't need to be worried about these topics. Conversely, there are a number of topics that boa keepers should be worried about, but chances are you're not so worried about. So today I'm going to discuss some of the main things that people are worried about as far as keeping boas they just don't need to be worried about, and conversely the things they should be worried about. We'll also look at some beautiful boas like this one, so be sure to stay tuned. The first thing that you don't need to be worried about that people ask all the time is about what side of the cage their boa's on. And so maybe their boa's hanging out always on the hot side, never the cool side, or maybe it's only hanging out on the cool side. A related topic is a boa that will only be hanging out in the hiding place versus a boa that never goes in the hiding place. And the worry is that they need to be concerned that the boa isn't using its entire cage like this. So chances are pretty good, as long as your environmental conditions are where they should be, you just don't need to be worried about this. So just make sure you have a hot spot, typically between around 88 to 90 degrees, and you have a cool side that's about 75 to 80 degrees, and your relative humidity is somewhere between 60 and 80%, and you should be fine. Every boa is a little different. They all have their own behavioral idiosyncrasies, so some are just not going to want to hang out in the open very much. Others aren't going to want to go into the hiding place. If you see all of your boas behaving a certain way, like they're all hugging the hot spot or hugging the cool spot, you should really double check your environmental conditions, make sure you have the right temperatures and humidity. But as long as you do, you just don't need to be worried about an individual preference of a boa for one part of the cage. So now for the first thing that you should be worried about that you might not be worried about, and that is mites. And I actually did a full video about mites, one of my first videos after I started the channel, so check that one out for the full details. But mites are the bane of all reptile keepers. And if you haven't come in contact with them yet, chances are pretty good, as long as you're buying reptiles, that at some point you will. And so mites are a blood-sucking arthropod parasite. They've actually become more and more common in the last few decades, and it appears that they're becoming more and more resistant to the treatments that people are using to get rid of them. Many reptile shows have mites. In fact, the time I got mites, it was from a reptile show. Mites, once they get into your collection, are extremely difficult to get rid of. So the best strategy to address them is to do long quarantine periods for new acquisitions. At a minimum, 3 months quarantine in a separate room, preferably 6 months quarantine. Before you put the new reptile into your main reptile room, you want to make sure there's no mites, because if they do get into the main reptile collection, it can take months and months to get rid of them. People will find that certain treatments seem to be effective at first, and they seem to be gone, but then a few months later the mites come back. Unfortunately, all it takes is one single mite to restart the infestation, because they can reproduce hermaphroditically. What I would recommend is that you use multiple treatments at the same time, and you treat for at least 2 to 3 months to disrupt the life cycle of the mite. And as I mentioned, my previous video has more details about mites. But mites are a terrible experience to have these things. They can drive you crazy trying to get rid of them. In fact, I know of several reptile keepers who fought mites for years and then unfortunately had to get out of the hobby. It was so stressful. I think the mites exist in many people's collections. They might not even realize it, because they're buying and selling reptiles so quickly, almost like baseball cards. So they might be passing on the mite infestation to the next owner without even realizing it. So the best strategy is just to have a closed collection and not bring any new reptiles that might infest your collection with mites. The next category of things that you shouldn't be worried about is kind of a broad category, and it's pretty much what everyone else is doing on social media as far as boa keeping. I read social media a lot. I don't really participate that much. I'm really more of an administrator for many of the boa groups, but I see a lot of boa related advice that's just plain wrong and can be very damaging if somebody followed it. So worry about your own husbandry and do what works for you. Don't really worry about what someone else is saying. One of the areas where this is the most relevant is your feeding schedule. And so I've said before that, you know, feeding is one of the most commonly discussed topics as far as boas, and there's so many opinions out there. In general, people tend to either overfeed boas or underfeed boas, unfortunately. And I've made quite a few videos on feeding boas and feeding schedules, but typically I would recommend for younger boas feeding anywhere from every 10 days to every 2 weeks. For mature boas, feeding everywhere from once every 3 to 4 weeks. And then, of course, a roughly 2-month fast during the winter cooling as well. So a lot of people are just obsessed and they want the ideal feeding strategy. They want to know exactly how often they should feed their boa. And this really varies. Okay, there's not one size fits all. You can vary your feeding schedule based on your boa's body shape. You want a boa that's going to be lean and muscular without being too thin, but you don't want a boa that's round or fatty or squishy. So a true red tail like this one should show really good muscle tone and muscle definition. You can see along the side there's kind of this lateral kind of indentation where you see the muscle definition. And boas, especially true red tail, should be really square. Okay, so they have a very square cross section, almost like a loaf of bread. They should also be taller than they are wide. So the height from the belly to the back should be about 1.5 to 2 times the thickness. And that's a good body shape for a true red tail boa. And some people are just obsessed. They want, like, I'm going to feed every 18.5 days. I'm going to feed a rat that weighs 332 grams. And they have this kind of bogus formula. But, boas don't really live like that. In nature, they're just going to eat whatever they come across. They're not, also they're going to eat a mixture of different size things. So I mix it up quite a bit. I don't feed them with the same interval between meals every time. I might feed a boa, once a week, and then I might skip 3 weeks, or I might feed them a medium rat and then go to a jumbo mouse and then to a quail. I kind of mix it up because it gives them variety, and that's probably more similar to what their natural diet would be. But if someone tells you that you need to be feeding this exact schedule, chances are that they're just going to be wrong, and there's a lot of ways of doing this, and there's never going to be a one size fits all. This goes for all different types of husbandry supplies. I often see people having keyboard wars over things like substrate choice, and somebody telling them, no, that substrate is the worst, you can't use that, that's a terrible choice. And that's just not how it is. There's many different types of substrates. They all have their pros and cons. What substrate works for one person in one boa might not work for another one. But in many cases, there's just no right or wrong. So don't worry about what all the other people on Facebook tell you about your boa keeping. And now for something that you should worry about when it comes to your boa's feeding schedule. That's overfeeding or underfeeding. And unfortunately, I've seen quite a bit of both that goes on these days. So in the past, many boa-related books and books on snake keeping in general suggested that boas be fed once a week, and that was kind of the rule of thumb. For most boas, that's going to be too much, and it could lead to an overweight boa. So as a result of people feeding them every week, there was we've all seen pictures of these really fatty, obese boas. And so people came up with this idea called slow growing, where they greatly reduce the food intake and the boa grows slower than it would when it's being fed a lot. For most cases, you kind of want to be in the middle. You don't want to overfeed or underfeed. And I think a lot of people had a tendency to underfeed. They were so concerned about overfeeding their boa, they decided that they're going to feed it once every 6 weeks for like a 1 or 2 year old boa. If you're feeding your boa the right amount of food, it's going to have a good body shape, just like this one. It's going to be muscular and lean without being fatty, but it's not going to be overly thin either. For most boas, especially the true red tails, they're going to take 4 or 5 years to reach breeding size. Typically they're going to grow somewhere around 8 to 12 inches a year for most locality boas. A lot of the morph boas will grow faster, a foot, 1.5 feet a year. But for most locality boas like the true red tails, you're probably not going to get more than about 1 foot or so of growth per year, and that's fine. You don't want to underfeed it. If your boa is not growing that much, you should increase the food a little bit, but you don't want to overfeed either. There's a little bit of wiggle room. You don't need an exact feeding schedule. You just have to look at your boa's body shape and use common sense. And for every boa, the exact food amount that's ideal is going to be a little bit different, so you have to take that into account as well. But you should definitely worry about having a boa that's either overweight and really fatty looking, or one that's not growing fast enough because it's being grossly underfed. The next thing that you shouldn't be worried about, this applies specifically to new people to boas, people who have less than a year of experience keeping boas, and that is breeding boas. Okay, when you first get into boas, you should be concerned about learning as much as you can about the boas. You shouldn't really be concerned about breeding them. And so in the past, when there was a not too much breeding of reptiles going on in captivity, people would always recommend that everyone get a pair of the animals so they can breed them eventually. And this made sense at the time, but these days there's more reptiles than there used to be many decades ago, so there's just less of a need for everybody to be breeding these animals. In addition, breeding boas is a lot more challenging and involved than you might think. So when you're first getting into reptiles, or even into boas, you should really just be focusing on learning everything that you can about the boas, because you're going to need that basic husbandry knowledge in order to breed them successfully. So if you've been in keeping boas for several years and you figured out all the husbandry, at that point, it would make sense to worry about breeding them. But up till then, you probably just want to focus again on, learning the husbandry and the best way to maintain the boas. Of course, you can always get a pair, a male and a female, even if you're a beginner, because you don't necessarily have to breed them, and you might want to have 2 pet boas of the same type. That way, if you do decide to breed them, you'll have them ready to go. And because it typically takes 4 to 5 years for most locality boas to reach breeding size, that gives you plenty of time to worry about learning the basic husbandry. So I've seen quite a few people that get into boas and they're just so excited about their future breeding plans. They get a logo and they get all kinds of paraphernalia. I've seen people with magnets for the side of their cars and t-shirts and mugs and refrigerator magnets, but they haven't even bred any boas yet. They're just so concerned about this whole boa breeding operation that they want to get into. The sad truth is probably about 90% of the people that start trying to breed boas are not really successful ultimately. It's just very challenging. It takes a lot of persistence. It takes many years, and you're likely to have a lot of failures. So a lot of people, the vast majority, do give up before they're successful. I'm not trying to discourage anybody, because boa breeding isn't brain surgery. It doesn't require any super talents or any kind of special skills. It just requires a lot of persistence. So if you're really focused on breeding boas, as I mentioned, chances are you will have some setbacks and things are not going to go as you plan, but ultimately you will be successful. But from the beginning, when you get your first boa, you shouldn't be planning your breeding until you have a little bit more experience. Now for something you really should be concerned about. And I actually did a couple of videos on this topic recently, and that has to do with some of the pending legislation which would affect keeping boas, reptiles, and really all exotic pets. And as I mentioned in my previous videos, there's currently a law that's pending in the Senate called the America Competes Act, and it has several revisions to the Lacey Act, which, if voted into law by the Senate and signed by the President, would greatly alter reptile keeping as we know it. You wouldn't be able to take probably virtually every species of reptile across state lines, so it would effectively end the reptile industry as we know it. I'm not going to go into the details about this before. Check out my earlier video if you want the details. So that law was approved by the House. It's pending in the Senate. Nothing's really happened to my knowledge in the last month or so. There's been plenty of things that our government needs to worry about without worrying about this act. So hopefully it won't pass, but we really do need to be concerned about this. Okay, because if this passes, I don't know how the reptile industry would continue. So a lot of people are saying things like, well, it's not really a reptile ban. You just can't take reptiles across state lines. Okay, so you wouldn't be able to take your pet reptile to the vet in another state. Say there was a exotic reptile vet just over the state lines. That would be a felony. You won't be able to move to another state with your reptiles. That would be a felony. a lot of breeders would have to get out of business because they can't ship their reptiles across state lines. Reptile shows would probably end. Even reptiles at pet stores like the chain pet stores would probably no longer be sold because they have distribution hubs that need to truck them across state lines to get to the pet shops. So it would really be the end of reptile keeping. A lot of people are saying, well, this would affect so many people. I'm not even going to worry because we're talking not just about reptile keepers, but about anybody keeping an animal other than a domestic animal like a dog, cat, or farm animal. So it would also affect people keeping exotic birds and tropical fish and invertebrates and pretty much any other type of animal. However, make no mistake, this is not a fire drill. If the America Competes Act passes as it's written, this is going to become law, and it's going to have horrible consequences for reptile keeping. And right now, the fate just rests in the hands of 100 senators. So it's pretty scary if this thing does pass, because once it passes, it would be pretty hard to reverse this, and it would do a huge amount of damage to reptile keeping. So please continue to stay vigilant and watch for updates on this America Competes Act. Our best bet is supporting the USARK, the United States Association of Reptile Keepers, to fight this type of unfair legislation that has all kinds of awful unintended consequences. So one last worry for this video that you just don't need to be concerned about, and that is the locality information of a non-locality boa. So by non-locality boa, I'm talking about a pet store boa or a boa that's been in captivity for multiple generations without any locality information that's been kept, or a boa that's been crossed with other locality boas as far as a breeding or morph project, or pretty much most of the morph boas at this point. These animals are just not locality specific. They don't really have any locality info. So either the locality info was lost many generations ago, or in most cases, they're just a mixture of a lot of different hypothetical localities. So they're not even really a locality boa at this point. In order to support a locality boa claim, you really need all of the information around the boa, its ancestry, and a record of its pedigree, just so that you can support or justify that your boa is really that particular locality. In some cases, you may have a true locality boa that's pure, but you can't really differentiate just by looking. So for example, a Guyana and a Suriname boa, there's no way to tell apart the two just by looking. So you can't tell if the ancestors of that boa originated in Guyana or in Suriname. In many opinions, there's really no scientific or biological difference between the two anyway. But just by looking at a picture, I get pictures all the time of a boa. When someone asks me if it's from Guyana or Suriname, there's just no way to tell. So you really shouldn't be worried about this. And this isn't a negative thing. It's, a lot of boas are perfectly good pets, and you could get a huge amount of information or enjoyment out of them without knowing their precise locality specific information. So at this point, a lot of these boas are pretty much domestic animals. They've been in captivity for multiple generations. We've already changed their behavior substantially in order, they're becoming better adapted to captivity. So even if they were a pure locality boa, they're not really even representative of it anyway. So you can pretty much at that point just think of the localities of the boa as wherever you live. So if you live on Long Island, you got a Long Island locality boa. So the last thing that you should be worried about to end the video is keeping track of your specific locality information if you have a locality specific boa. So all it takes is one generation, one keeper, one breeder to lose this information, and it's lost. The chain of information is lost. So for example, this is a Barranquilla locality Colombian boa right here. And this animal was bred by my buddy Michael Beach from offspring that came from Rio Bravo reptiles. So it's basically the chain of custody going back to the founder animals. So we can feel pretty comfortable that this is indeed a Barranquilla locality, Colombia Boa Imperator. However, if I don't have that information, if I didn't pass that on to the customers, if I do eventually breed this animal and sell the babies, I need to be careful and make sure that all of the people obtaining the babies know exactly where these animals came from, so they can continue passing this information on. And we really need this information if locality-specific boas are going to continue. Unfortunately, sometimes people kind of try to fudge the information. They might not really know, but it looks to them like it's from a specific locality, so they might kind of fudge it. It's not what you want to do. You really want to keep that information and be honest and upfront with people when you're selling the boas. Some locality boas might be from a country, Suriname, Peru, etc., and we don't really know any more than that, and that's fine. It's just not as specific of a locality as, say, a Barranquilla Colombia Boa, okay, because we're talking about just the city, or, you know, in some cases it's actually the port of export. So what I would recommend is, when you start to acquire your boa collection, keep all of the receipts from the breeders and, you know, the sellers of the boas, and ask them carefully and explicitly, where did they get the animal, what is the bloodline, what can they tell you about that, because this is really important information to maintain and to pass on to the people who will get the babies. Or if you do happen to sell the animals, you can have that information to pass on and keep that information available to the hobby, so we don't lose the locality information of the true locality boas. Incidentally, if you do decide to breed it to another locality that's different, you can't really make a claim that it's locality specific anymore, unless it's, say, like two different animals from two different parts of Suriname. If you bred them together, you can still call it a Suriname locality boa, but you can't really call it like a Pokemon Suriname if you breed to another locality. So keep that information well managed and organized. So there you have it, some things that you may be worrying about that you shouldn't be worrying about, and some things that you should be worrying about if you're not already worrying about them. I hope you don't lose any sleep about these things, but you should probably keep them in your mind if you're going to continue in the boa hobby. So I hope you enjoyed the video. As always, shoot me any questions or comments you have. If you have anything that you are worried about, add it to the comments. I probably missed a few things that we all need to be worried about. Thanks for watching, and enjoy your boas.